Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Make sure that you like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. It's a major week across the National Hockey League and a major week for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So we will close out this live, as we always do, answering every single one of your questions. But this week, we will answer all of your questions about anything and everything leading up to Friday's trade deadline that is going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern time. But first, we're going to discuss a little bit about a hard-fought matchup that the Penguins had yesterday against the Colorado Avalanche. I know that they lost 4-1, but that game was much closer than the final score indicated. And then I will share my 3 stars of the week. But again, the majority of time in this episode is going to be spent talking to you guys and answering questions about the trade deadline and what could happen between now and 3 p.m. Eastern on Friday afternoon with the Pittsburgh Penguins. But like I said, let's start things off with a little discussion about yesterday. The Penguins fall to the Colorado Avalanche by a final score of 4-1, but they played way better than that score indicated. In fact, for large portions of that game, they outplayed a very good Colorado Avalanche team that is not just good in general, they're very good at Ball Arena in Colorado. So to play them there as well as the Penguins did, you have to tip your cap to this team because they do still have a lot of fight left in the chamber, considering the fact that the Penguins are fighting for better better NHL draft lottery seating. It seems like the fact that they were able to go out there and play the way that they did, you have to tip your cap. Now, there's 2 people that I want to highlight, especially on today's show. First, let's go with the guy that's been here longer. Let's give the nod to Alex Nedeljkovic, because coming out of the Four Nations break, Alex Nedeljkovic had been playing very, I could say very 30 times, and it still probably wouldn't be enough, very poorly for this first, I believe he played 3 or 4 games before getting yanked late last week against the Philadelphia Flyers. But ever since then, he's kind of found his footing, and you have to give some credit there because he had a rough first 5 against the Boston Bruins, yet another first goal allowed on the first shot. But since that first period against the Boston Bruins, he has played 5 consecutive, very strong periods for the Pittsburgh Penguins between the pipes. From that second period onward, in 5 periods, Nedeljkovic has only given up 2 goals, and he has a .944 save percentage. Now, 2 of those 5 periods were against a Boston Bruins team that was without Charlie McAvoy, and that was without Brad Marchand. But still, he was able to stand on his head and keep the Pittsburgh Penguins in that game. Now, they ultimately fell short. They ended up losing 3-2 in that one, but it would have been much further apart if not for the way that Alex Nedeljkovic was able to play on Saturday afternoon. And then last night, he had himself a really, really solid performance. This was the Alex Nedeljkovic that we saw leading into the Four Nations face-off break, the one that won 4-1-2 going into the Four Nations, that had a .930 plus save percentage going into the Four Nations. It was kind of a bounce back that I don't think a lot of people expected, but it's a bounce back that is well welcomed by the Pittsburgh Penguins. So shout out to Alex Nedeljkovic. He had himself a solid night on Tuesday, and I would imagine that he gets the start again on Friday as the Penguins take on the Vegas Golden Knights. That is, of course, if he remains on the roster. I would say that more than likely he is, but never say never when it comes to trade deadline week, especially with a team as fully engulfed in seller mode as the Pittsburgh Penguins appear to be. And the second player that I want to mention is a player that we saw for the very first time in a Pittsburgh Penguins uniform last night, and that is Vladislav Kolyachonok. A lot of people, myself included, were questioning why the Pittsburgh Penguins hadn't had him playing earlier. Since they came back from that break, it's been kind of a combination of Ryan Graves and Vincent Desharnais, Ryan Shea and Vincent Desharnais, and even when Shea had to take Prio Joseph's spot at the top of the defense lineup, it was Ryan Graves who got the first nod again with Vincent Desharnais. We all wondered, why haven't they used Vladislav Kolyachonok? They claimed him off of waivers at the beginning of the Four Nations break, and it seems as if Mike Sullivan kind of gave a nod to that after the game, saying we haven't really gotten a full opportunity to understand his skill set and to get him kind of assimilated in to the Pittsburgh Penguins system because, well, they had the Four Nations break, so nobody was on the ice. And since then, they've been very busy with games and haven't had a lot of practices. Well, Kolyachonok gets the opportunity against the Colorado Avalanche, and he looked very good. I'm not going to say that he looked spectacular. Nothing jumped off the page and wowed me to say that this guy is the future of the position, but he played a solid game. Now, only 11 minutes and 34 seconds of ice time. He was somewhat sheltered in the fact that he didn't play a lot of ice time. Not only that, but when he did, it was a lot of favorable matchups that he was going up against. But that's exactly what you want out of the Pittsburgh Penguins with a young defenseman that you're hoping can come in here and do exactly what you've seen out of Cody Glass and kind of make a statement saying he can be part of the short-term plans at least. Same thing we're seeing with Phil Tomasino. That's what they want to get out of Vladislav Kolyachonok here in the last 20 games of the season. And that's what they got yesterday. He made, I think, one mistake. As far as what I'm remembering, there was only one that I noticed, and it was a big one because midway through the third period, he's getting pressured on by a forechecking Colorado Avalanche, and he turns the puck over, and it leads to a great scoring chance. But fortunately, Alex Nedeljkovic, who we talked about already, was able to stand up tall and make the save and kind of bail out Kolyachonok. But outside of that play, he looked really good. He showed off his skating prowess, which is by far the headline when it comes to this guy's game. He's not afraid to shoot the puck. Early in the game, he was getting a lot of shots on goal, creating a couple opportunities in the offensive end of the ice. And, you know, at the end of the day, the eye test and the analytics test, they kind of matched up in this one. He had the highest game score of any defenseman for the Pittsburgh Penguins in that game last night, according to Hockey Stat Cards, and only lower game scorecard than Sidney Crosby, Brian Rust, and Rickard Rakell. So as far as debuts with the Penguins organization goes, that was a very solid one for Vladislav Kolyachonok. I'm excited to see what he has to give for the rest of this 18-game stretch between now and the end of the season. Where does he get deployed? Does he play at all on the penalty kill? Does he get any opportunities post-deadline on the power play? Of course, we'll have to see what happens with guys like Matt Grzelcyk, and Erik Karlsson is still being talked about a little bit out there. But I'm interested to see and intrigued to see how they utilize Kolyachonok and if he can maintain what we saw on Tuesday night. Now let's move over and talk about the 3 stars of the week. And this one was fairly obvious. Yes, a lot of people said on Monday when I did my power rankings that Ryan Shea should have been in the conversation. I'll say this. Power rankings is reserved for players who have been able to do it over an extended period of time. Ryan Shea had himself a week. He had himself a great week. 3 goals, which brings his career total to 4 total, and was playing some pretty decent hockey at the top of the defensive lineup next to Kris Letang. And he does deserve a little bit of credit for doing that. But this 3 stars of the week, in my opinion, goes to the only guys that are pushing consistent offense on the Pittsburgh Penguins. Let's start at number 3 with Brian Rust. Rust's a guy I talked about earlier this week that it seemed like Sunday he started to put everything back together, that he missed some time due to an injury a few weeks back. He came back from the Four Nations break and he was sick, so he missed a few games there. And it seemed like the back-to-back games against the Philadelphia Flyers was just him trying to get his feet underneath him. Over the weekend, it looked like he finally got there. And on Tuesday, he was all the way there. He was back to even strength, full strength, alongside Rickard Rakell and Sidney Crosby. He's been finding his game very well, and he's been putting points on the score sheet. 1 goal, 4 assists in 4 games played for Brian Rust. He is the 3rd star of the week, and he solidified it last night with that insane pass for the Penguins' lone goal of the game. The person he passed it to was Rickard Rakell, and Rickard Rakell is going to be my number 2 star of the week. 4 games played, 4 goals. That's a pretty clean sheet, if you ask me. That brings his career or season total up to 29 goals on the year, 1 away from his 3rd career 30-goal season, and certainly on pace to smash his career high in goals if he remains with the Penguins and remains with Sidney Crosby and stays on this pace. Now, he is every bit of what you needed when it came to replacing Jake Gensel in the goal-scoring category. The only issue is, 1, you then needed somebody to replace Rickard Rakell, which the Penguins didn't get. Their best answer at that point was Anthony Beauvillier, and he just wasn't it. He's having a decent season, but he certainly isn't a top 6 player for this team this year. Rakell also doesn't have the facilitator mode that Jake Guentzel was able to do. Rakell is a good facilitator. He can get assists. He's great when it comes to passing the puck, but Jake Guentzel is elite at that level. So while Rickard Rakell has kind of caught up to and helped facilitate the drop-off in goals from Jake Guentzel, the assists are still leaving a little bit more to be desired. He's having a great season. I'm not trying to bash on the guy at all. I'm just saying, while nobody could have lived up to what Jake Guentzel would have brought here in this game or in this season, but Rickard Rakell is as close as you can get. So you have to give him credit for that one. And the number one star of the week, let's just make it the whole line. The number one star of the week is going to be Sidney Crosby. 4 games played, 1 goal, 5 assists in that time. He is currently riding a 4-game point streak and has points in 13 of the last 15 games played. So at this point in time, if you keep Sidney Crosby off the score sheet, that is a tremendous feat because he is absolutely filling up the score sheet and he's filling up the back of the net as well. I talked about this a little bit on Monday, but he is scoring more and more and more on his own in this past month. I know that I said that in the last 4 games, he only has 1 goal, but if you go back the last 14, he has scored 8 times, which over an 82 game season would put him on a 47 goal pace. That is how red hot Sidney Crosby has been for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He can do it all. This past week, it's been more facilitator mode, 5 assists in 4 games played. But over the past 14 games, he's been scoring at nearly a 50-goal pace. And that is with the 4 Nations break in the middle of that, not to mention the fact that he dealt with an injury in the middle of all of this. So he is an absolute animal once again for the Pittsburgh Penguins. This line, Rust, Rakell, and Sidney Crosby, has accounted for 6 of the Penguins' last 8 goals. Hence the reason they are my entire 3 stars of the week. I understand that there's 18 games left. This Penguins team has won 1 game in the last calendar month, it feels like. But this line alone, again, if Rickard Rakell remains on the team, that's something that you have to mention this week. But if this line remains intact past Friday at 3, it is worth tuning in for alone. So that's my 3 stars of the week. Brian Rust at number 3, Rickard Rakell at number 2, and Sidney Crosby. He's the number 1 on the power rankings every week. He's typically the number 1 in the 3 stars of the week every week. He is just that dang good, and you have to appreciate being able to watch him night in and night out. But that's all for my agenda today. Now, the last thing on this episode's agenda is answering all of your questions. So we're going to take a quick break. When we return, answering all of your trade deadline related or just Pittsburgh Penguins in general related questions. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, live today on YouTube as we are every single Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern. Now this week, it's a little bit of a special week because we are 2 days away. We are 49 hours, 48 hours, and 45 minutes as of this very moment from the NHL's trade deadline. So I definitely want to make sure that I answer all of your trade deadline related questions. Make sure that you drop them in the comment section below. We already have a handful of questions, and we'll get to as many as we can before this hour is over. Let's start with Sonny, who says, with the salary cap rising over the next few years, do you think general managers will trend more towards overpaying individual talent at the expense of overall team construction? See also Erik Karlsson in air quotes. Well, Sonny, I think that this is something that we see pretty much every summer once you get to free agency, that people tend to overpay in free agency no matter who they're getting. If it's a guy the caliber of Erik Karlsson, shoot, if it's a guy the caliber of Erik Haula, if they get to free agency, typically you're going to have to overpay. See Brian Rust, whenever he signed his deal a couple of years ago. Yeah, that was in favor of the Penguins, but they got a little bit taken off the top simply because he didn't get to the open market, that he didn't get to see what else was out there. So I do think that we're going to see bigger overpays simply because we always see bigger overpays in the summer. And with a higher cap going into next year, that's just going to get even bigger and bigger. That's the reason that we saw Leon Draisaitl signed for $14 million. I venture to guess that we're going to see Mikko Rantanen sign for something in that ballpark. Mitch Marner is probably going to come in somewhere in that ballpark, although it's going to be interesting because will the Toronto Maple Leafs want to give him more than Austin Matthews? Again, remains to be seen. It could just typically be that they don't want to go over Matthews, even though the market calls for it because of that salary cap jump that you mentioned. I do think that for the most part, general managers are going to shy away from just saying, hey, this guy's great. It doesn't matter if he fits on our team or not. Usually that happens when a team is desperate. See Erik Karlsson 2 off seasons ago. The Penguins had just missed the playoffs for the first time in 16 years. Kyle Dubas was in his first summer as the Pittsburgh Penguins general manager, and it was truncated because he came in really late in the process just before the NHL draft. So he really didn't get an opportunity to really put all of his kind of eggs into one basket when it came to the NHL draft. It was a truncated preparation season for the Pittsburgh Penguins before that offseason, and his job was simple. Get this team that missed by 1 standings point back into the playoffs so we could see Crosby, so we could see Malkin, and so Fenway Sports Group could see some playoff revenue come in for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He was a little bit desperate, and because of that, he swung big. He brought in Erik Karlsson, even though now that we look in hindsight, the guy hasn't fit. But still, you look back at it, at the time, you brought in the reigning Norris Trophy winner who had over 100 points with the San Jose Sharks. You thought that no matter whether or not he's a great fit or not, that much talent, with the talent the Penguins already had, would have fit. But I do think that you're going to see some overpaying this summer simply because we always do. I'm not sure it's going to change how GMs view just simply bringing in a guy with a lot of talent, whether or not he fits with what your team actually needs. Let's go to Ryan, who says, do you see the Kings trading for Rickard, Rakell, and could you see Brandt Clarke as part of that deal? I don't know where the Kings stand with their young defenseman, Brandt Clarke. Earlier in the year, actually just about a month ago, he was taken out of the lineup. He was a healthy scratch, and questions started to come up of, well, are they going to move on from Brandt Clarke? Does he fit in their plans? He's gotten into a couple of games since then. I'm not quite sure where they stand on Brandt Clarke, but a player of that caliber would be needed in return for Rickard Rakell. If Rickard Rakell is going to get traded, it is going to be for an absolute haul. I wouldn't be surprised if a first-round pick is included. Actually, I'd be surprised if it wasn't included, and I would be surprised if there isn't a B+ to A level prospect that's included, and Brandt Clarke would be one of them. The Kings are a team that going into this trade deadline need to arm up because it is almost now or never for them. This is the 4th consecutive season that they are in line to play the Edmonton Oilers in the first round of the playoffs. None of those series were they able to take down the Edmonton Oilers. So when you're gearing up to play the Oilers, defense is great. Stellar goaltending is great, and that can get you a long way. But you're going up against Draisaitl and McDavid in some games, at least once, maybe twice in that series. If you're going to take them down, you need to simply outscore them. Bringing in a guy like Rakell will certainly help that aspect. I'm sure Rakell would not be opposed to going back to Southern California. The taxes kind of stink, but the weather is gorgeous. And the LA Kings are a team that if they can get past the Edmonton Oilers, there is absolutely no reason that they cannot go on a run and make it all the way to the Stanley Cup. Once you get there, anything can happen. It depends on who's hot and who's hotter coming out of the East. But I think the Kings could be a team that inquires about Rickard Rakell. And if so, and if that gets close to the finish line, I wouldn't be surprised if Brandt Clarke was in those conversations. Let's go to Evan. Shout out to Evan. You notice I made sure that my face didn't randomly pop up as we were waiting for questions. But Evan asks, curious on your thoughts, but I'm hoping once Brian Rust's no movement clause expires, they don't trade him. I think once Crosby, Malkin, and Letang leave, he'd be a great mentor for the young guys. He's a Penguin for life in my eyes. I think a lot of people would tend to agree with that sentiment, Evan. And personally, as somebody who has watched this kid's career from start until current day, I think the Pittsburgh Penguins would benefit greatly from having Brian Rust stick around as part of that rebuild. You look around the team right now and you ask, who's going to be here in 3 years when Sidney Crosby is probably going to be playing who knows how long Sidney Crosby will play. He might outlast everybody on this roster right now in the Penguins organization. But I think a lot of people say that once Malkin moves on after next year, at least expectedly, Brian Rust is the guy that they're going to want to put an assistant captain logo on. There's a reason that he signed for 6 years. He wants to be in Pittsburgh, and I think Pittsburgh wants him to stay here. And as long as he's performing the way that he is, it's hard to imagine that the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to look at that and say, yeah, let's completely gut our entire leadership group. If they're trading away Karlsson, he's seen as somebody that's part of that leadership group. You might move on from him this summer. Rickard Rakell is kind of, I don't want to say part of the leadership group, but he's part of the more experienced group of players in this locker room. There's a chance he's gone this summer. Evgeni Malkin, we talked about that already, might only have 1 year left. Who knows what happens with Kris Letang for the remainder of his career? You're going to want to keep some guys there to instill in these younger guys what the locker room is supposed to be like, what the atmosphere is supposed to be like surrounding the Pittsburgh Penguins. You're going to have Crosby. No matter what, you're going to have Crosby. But I think that the ownership group values Brian Rust in a very similar way. At least from the outside looking in, it feels as if they do. So I agree with you. While Rust's trade stock might be very high in the fact that you don't have to, he doesn't have full control after this summer, there might be conversations, but there is a lot of value to keeping Brian Rust on the roster. And something tells me that Kyle Dubas feels a similar way. Whether he feels it enough to completely wipe out the prospect of trading him, that much remains to be seen. But I think that there's at least a little part of Dubas and the Penguins as a whole that views Brian Rust as a Penguin for life, just like you do, Evan. Let's go to Ryan, who says, will teams see through Rakell's, quote, production when trading for him? He's kind of a pretender out there and gets carried by Sid. I'm convinced teams won't pay what the fan base is expecting for him. Here's the thing. How long did we hear Jake Guentzel simply get called a product of Sidney Crosby? And yet he goes to the Carolina Hurricanes and he plays extremely well. Led the league in points post-trade deadline last year of anybody that was traded at the deadline. That was Guentzel. He was phenomenal in the playoffs. And now you look down in Tampa this year and he's phenomenal once again. So he wasn't a product of Sidney Crosby. Did he benefit from playing with Sidney Crosby? Certainly. But he wasn't a product of Sidney Crosby. I see Rickard Rakell in a similar fashion this year. Yes, he's playing with Sidney Crosby, and Sidney Crosby is phenomenal. He is going to open up looks for you and tap in goals for you more so than a lot of other players, most other players in the National Hockey League. He's not a pretender, though. He is a bona fide goal scorer. Is he somebody that's going to come out there and facilitate his butt off and be a 1 goal, 3 assist guy in a major game? Probably not. He can do that every once in a while, but more than likely, he's a trigger man. You're going to bring him in to be the trigger man, and he does that at a very high level. A lot of people were down on him because of last year. Here's the problem with last year. When a trigger man has a bum shoulder, it makes it a little bit harder to aim when you're pointing the gun. This year, his shoulder was back to full strength, And not only is he scoring goals, but he's scoring goals at a higher level and higher pace than he has in 6 or 7 seasons. He is certainly benefiting from playing with Crosby, but I'm not going to say that he's a pretender out there. I think that his shot is vastly underrated still when he's on the brink of another 30-goal season, and I think other teams will see that. And here's the thing. If they don't want to pay that, it's fine. Kyle Dubas is probably A-okay with saying, if you're not going to give me what I want, I'll just let Rickard Rakell continue to put butts in seats for the rest of the season, and we'll look to trade him in the offseason. I know that a lot of people in the fan base are saying, oh, maybe a first. I think it was Emily Kaplan of ESPN who said Matthias Michelli, a first and a second. That might be a bit much. It might be a bit much, but a first should be on the table, and a decent player should be on the table as well. I don't know if they'd get a second-round pick included in that, and I don't know if they'd get, like we talked, I believe it was yesterday, about the Buffalo Sabres and JJ Peterka. You're not going to get a first in Peterka for Rickard Rakell. You're not, because there's too much upside with JJ Peterka at 23 years old and a first-round pick, even though they've been kind of doled out like candy on Halloween this year. There's still a lot that it takes to get a first-round pick, and Rickard Rakell himself probably wouldn't garner that type of response, but he's still going to, if traded, bring a lot back in return for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I don't see him as a pretender, but if you do, listen, that's your opinion, and that's why we have this forum, so you can say your opinion over here. Let's go to Amico, who's talking about Rickard Rakell again, who says Rakell for, I believe you're talking about Nick Robertson from the Toronto Maple Leafs, a first and a third. Makes some sense. Again, I'm not quite sure you're going to get the third-round pick with that, and then it looks like something I could see happening. Now, if I'm the Penguins, do I like that? I think I like that enough. If it ends up being Rakell for Robertson, a first and a third, I like that a lot. If it's Rakell for Robertson and a first, I think you look at that and you say, yeah, that'll work, and that allows you to then have 3 first-round picks in this year's draft. If not, you have 2 first-round picks in next year's draft, which is even better, and that third can be used whether or not you want to actually draft somebody. Like I mentioned earlier, Jake Gensel, we've talked about a lot in this episode. He was a third-round pick, or you can utilize that in a trade either next year or the year after if you think you're getting closer to a playoff spot, depending on when that third-round pick is. And Nick Robertson, interesting scenario. We talked about him a lot this year because it's been, well, he's on his way out, and then the next thing you know, it's quiet on all fronts in Toronto, and then you hear again, well, maybe he's on the trade deadline once again. What do they want to do with Nick Robertson? What does he want to do with Toronto? Because a lot of this conversation for Nick Robertson has been he doesn't like the position that the organization is putting him in up in Toronto. Has he softened on that? Does he want to stay there simply because he thinks, well, maybe we can win some Stanley Cups here because they've been having a pretty good season this year and it is wide open in the Eastern Conference? I don't know. But I think that Rakell for, again, whether it's a younger NHL player that has kind of fallen out of favor, like a Robertson, like a Nils Hoglander, although I'm not sure the Canucks are a great fit for Rickard Rakell, and a first-round pick, that's what I see kind of being the starting point, especially with reports from Josh Yohe that, listen, the price is going to be absolutely massive if somebody wants to get Rickard Rakell. Whether or not somebody will pay that remains to be seen, but it doesn't change the fact that the price is high, and Kyle Dubas has the best thing behind him when it comes to that entire conversation. He has the power and he has the ability to walk away from the table and simply say, if you're not going to meet it, then we're done here. And I think that's going to help the Pittsburgh Penguins. And that's also why if Rakell gets traded, it's going to be for that higher price because Kyle Dubas won't accept anything different. Let's go to Evan again, who says, do you see Owen Pickering getting called up again after the trade deadline? And if so, should he be? I think it depends on what we see in the next 50 hours, whatever it is, 49 hours and 31 minutes at this point. Because if nobody gets traded on the blue line, not a lot of spots open right now, right? P.O. Joseph, you'd have to imagine, is not suffered a season-ending injury. So that's 8 guys. Even without P.O. Joseph, that's 7 guys right now. Who are you going to send down to make room for Owen Pickering? That's a big question mark going into the end of the season. Now, would I like to see Owen Pickering get another shot at the NHL level? I would love to see it. The more that we see of these young guys at the NHL, the happier I'm going to be, because I want to see what they have at the game's highest level. But at the same time, the Pittsburgh Penguins have made it abundantly clear that they are all in on making this Wilkes-Barre-Scranton run as good as it could possibly get and trying to keep that core of Penguins prospects together for that run. Now, Pickering after the deadline could come up and then go back down as long as he's on the AHL roster during Friday's trade deadline. But I think there is value in seeing what he can do if he comes up to the NHL level in the last, I guess it would be 18 games, or maybe if it's just a cup of coffee. I think it would be good to see what Pickering can do in a second opportunity at the NHL level. I'd like to see it. Whether or not we will depends on, does Grizzly get traded? Does P.O. Joseph, end up missing more time? Do they want to see more out of Ryan Graves? Because I'm not sure what they think about Ryan Graves, considering the deployment and the amount of healthy scratches and the timing of the healthy scratches that he's taken. So I think there's a lot of factors involved into whether or not he will, whether he should. I think that I'd like to see it. Let's go to Austin, who says, when the Pens are a good team, how long do you see them being a contender? They won't have a star talent like Sid, so I'd assume they would have to be a different version of good. That's the most likely scenario, that once Sid is gone, it's going to be some time before they have an A-level player. But at the same time, who's to say that they won't crash and burn next year and end up with Gavin McKenna? There's a chance that that happens. Who's to say they won't crash and burn the year after Sid's gone, and whoever at the age currently of like 13 or 12, and whoever could become the number one pick at that point, who's to say they're not the next superstar in the NHL? Certainly not going to be a Sidney Crosby. I'm not going to sit here and say that. They're certainly not going to be a Connor McDavid. I'm not going to sit here and say that, but could be a Jack Hughes. That changes a lot of things. Could be and I'm trying to think of some other, could be a Rasmus Dahlin. That changes a lot of things, especially if you know how to build around a star defenseman like that. So there's a chance that they end up getting the opportunity to get a grade A superstar player. But again, that remains to be seen, because the only one that's anywhere close is Gavin McKenna, and the Penguins would have to completely bottom out for a second season in a row, and much remains to be seen about whether or not that is possible. But more than likely, you're correct, Austin. They're going to have to be a different version of good. It's almost like the Seattle Kraken's current plan, because, yeah, they've had top picks. Matty Beniers is good, not an A-level superstar. Shane Wright is good, slower to develop than we expected, but he's not an A-level superstar. That team, when it's at its best, which it hasn't been this year or last, when it's at its best, that team is a conglomeration of multiple second lines, good defense, and then they rely on their goaltending, which hasn't been good this year because Philip Grubauer is a sieve. But that's more likely the path that you're going to see the Penguins have to take once Sidney Crosby is gone. But never say never when it comes to being able to get a grade A superstar on your team, because let's also not forget, how many times has Kyle Dubas compared what the Penguins need to do now to what the New York Rangers did a few years back? And the New York Rangers didn't have to wait to draft their superstar. Yeah, it helped that they got Capo Caco at 2 overall. It helped that the bingo balls bounced the right way for them and they got Alexis Lafreniere, but both of them ended up being middle 6, not top 6, and certainly not superstars. So what did they do? They had the cap space because they didn't have a bona fide star. They went out and paid a lot of money to bring in Artemi Panarin. So there's multiple ways to build a team. As of right now, the clearest path forward, while you still have Sidney Crosby on your roster and playing the way he has, is building up everything around him. And then once he leaves, hoping that the team is able to play better than the sum of their parts. And that's the most likely outcome as we stand here today. But again, a lot of things can change. Let's get back into the comment section here and see what else we got. David Knight says, what do you think of Sullivan's future in Pittsburgh? I think it's interesting. I think there's certainly a discussion to be had. He's not going to get fired before the end of the season. Obviously not. And I don't think he's getting fired this offseason, because if you look at where we're at right now, This team's expectations are to bottom out. So why would he get fired in that instance, especially when he has, for the longest time, had the backing of the star players? He's had the backing of the president of hockey operations and general manager, who is, by all intents and purposes, calling the shots for the organization. And just as a cherry on top, he has the backing of the ownership group, Fenway Sports. So his future in Pittsburgh, while I don't think it is guaranteed, I think it is pretty safe right now. If we're looking at the, hot seat o-meter, it's at a 1 out of 5. And I think the only reason it's at a 1 is for all the reasons that everybody wants him gone already. He hasn't won a playoff series. They disappointed in 2019. They disappointed in the bubble in 2020. They disappointed in 2021 when they were the number 1 seed of the then Eastern Division. I think it was the Eastern Division, whatever. The weird COVID season where the Bruins were in the Penguins division. The Pens won the division title. They disappointed in 2022 when they had a 3-1 series lead over the New York Rangers and they blew it. That's the reason that his hot seat can never go back to fully off unless he has success in Pittsburgh. But everything else involved, including the lowering of expectations this year, is the reason that he is nowhere close to being fired, at least not this year and not this offseason. We'll see what the expectations end up being next year, and that's when I think you can have the conversation. If they go out and they bring in, again, massive hypothetical, but one that I think is worth bringing into this conversation. If they bring in Mitch Marner, end up with a top 5 pick, and that player ends up being ready to go. Owen Pickering turns out to be ready to go and is very good next year. Kris Letang turns back the clock. Evgeni Malkin stays healthy and stays with his legs underneath him the way that we've seen the last 2 weeks for an entire season. Sidney Crosby does Sidney Crosby things, and all of a sudden you're looking at that team and you're saying at the very least they should be top 3 in the Metro, and they're not. That's when you start to have the conversation. But as of right now, we don't know the expectations for next season. We have to see what the Penguins do in the meantime to set the table for next year. But I think until that happens, you can't have a serious conversation about the odds that Mike Sullivan ends up being fired at some point next year, because I think that is the earliest that you're going to even be able to have this conversation. Let's go to the next question here. Do Tristan Jarry and or Ryan Graves get bought out this summer? No. That specifically, no. I would be shocked if Kyle Dubas decided to buy out anybody. He doesn't like doing it. He doesn't like that money on the books. He certainly doesn't like doing it with 2 players that are going to cost a heck of a lot of money for a heck of a lot of time on a buyout like a Tristan Jarry or a Ryan Graves. Now, does one of them get traded? I think the door is ajar for that. More specifically, Ryan Graves than Tristan Jarry. Why? Because there's 1, salary cap going up. 2, more defensive slots open than there is goaltending slots, so you're more willing to take a risk on a defenseman. And number 3, Ryan Graves has actually played half decent at the NHL level this year. Tristan Jarry hasn't even played half decent at the AHL level, making him way less likely to be somebody that a team would take a chance on. I think somebody would take a chance on Ryan Graves because he has past history in succeeding in Colorado. He did so in New Jersey. It hasn't worked out to the level that the Penguins expected. But again, he hasn't been awful this season. He's had some redeeming qualities of his play this season. The problem is there's nowhere in this lineup that he fits other than the third pairing. You can't put him with Karlsson. It's not a match. You can't put him with Letang. It's not a match. So opportunity is limited for him. I think another team might see that and say, if we give him the opportunity to build off of what he did in that season with Pittsburgh, maybe it's a diamond in the rough addition. And maybe, just maybe, he turns out to be the Ryan Graves that Kyle Dubas expected him to be when he signed him to that 6-year deal. Let's go to Brian, who says, Belsky, a redundant theme over the past 2 years is inconsistent effort. Why hasn't the core 3 lost their crap and demanded consistent effort? Is it time to admit the drive isn't the same for this team? There's a couple of things here. 1, who's to say they haven't? Sidney Crosby's not a rah-rah, I'm going to yell at you type of leader. Neither is Kris Letang. Evgeni Malkin doesn't strike me as anybody that's going to stand up and be that vocal of a leader either. That's where a guy like maybe a Brian Rust comes in. Seems understated, but it seems like a guy that could come in and do that. But overall, it's just not the Penguins' leadership style. So losing their crap doesn't seem like it's in the DNA of the Pittsburgh Penguins leadership core. It never has, and it it probably won't until we see a completely different leadership core. But the inconsistent effort is something that I've noticed as well. The problem is sometimes in an 82-game season, when it's gone as poor as it has, that's just bound to happen. These guys are competitive as heck. And yes, there's been times where the effort is lacking, but I wouldn't kind of misconstrue that as a lack of competitiveness. I wouldn't misconstrue that as a lack of care, because I feel like these guys care a lot. And that's why sometimes you look at the effort and it's like, man, did they know what time this game started? Because it said, and Seth Rohrabaugh of the Trib always puts out, this game is scheduled to start at 7:05. This game is scheduled to start at 1:18 p.m. And I always say, did anybody tell the team? Because it seems like it takes till 1:45 for them to actually start playing. That is something that whenever you're a team that has struggled as much as the Penguins, always creeps in. I find it hard to believe that any team that is in the bottom 5 of the NHL, bottom 8 of the NHL this season, hasn't had the same issue with inconsistent effort. And I understand the main difference here is those other teams don't have a leadership trio that has been in place for longer than any other trio in North American sports. But at the same time, it's just not their style. It might be better if they had that type of style for this type of team, but to this point, that hasn't been their style, and it's been 20 years. So I'm not expecting that to change all that much. Let's go to Dabton, who says, out of all the trade talks with players being linked to the Penguins, which one do you want the most, i.e. Höglander, Robertson, etc.? It's one that came out the latest, JJ Peterka, because that came out on Monday. Elliot Friedman of 32 Thoughts, the podcast, said, you know who is a picture-perfect target for the Pittsburgh Penguins? Didn't say that he was available, didn't say that they were in trade talks to acquire him, but said that if the Sabres were to shop him, the Pittsburgh Penguins would be a perfect fit. It's J.J. Peterka, 23 years old, had 50-plus points and 20-plus goals last year, certainly en route to do that again this year. He's, again, somebody that can play center, somebody that can play the wing. If the Penguins were to buy anything and they were to utilize, say, that New York Rangers first rounder, JJ Peterka is the best player that I have heard any rumblings about with the Pittsburgh Penguins, because a lot of these guys aren't being rumored to come to the Penguins. It's mainly a lot of guys on the Penguins being rumored to be shipped anywhere else. Höglander, we've heard about. Robertson, we've heard about. Brandt Clark, we've heard about a little bit. Trevor Zegras, that has not come up. That's something that I have speculated upon, but even including Zegras, I would still say JJ Peterka is the best name and the name that I would want to see the most end up in black and gold out of anybody that we've heard anything of over the last couple of months. Let's go to Ryan again, who says, if the Penguins retain 50%, wow, 50% is a lot, on Erik Karlsson's contract, what could a potential return look like? Well, a first-round pick, certainly, because you're getting Erik Karlsson for 2 years at $5 million. That's going to make him one of the most attractive players in the NHL. If not, that makes him the most attractive player in the NHL if the Penguins were to retain 50%. It's never going to happen. It's not. Kyle Dubas isn't going to say, yeah, let me just bookmark $10 million over the next 2 seasons to not pay Erik Karlsson, because, again, he doesn't like doing it at all. But if, in the spirit of your question, Ryan, if the Penguins were to retain 50 on Karlsson's contract and say, hey, whoever wants him, it's $5 million for the next 2 seasons, you're getting a first-round pick, you're getting a second-round pick, and then it depends on what Dubas wants from this other team, whoever it is. Do they have a young, solid NHLer? Dubas might want that, and that would be fair to include in that trade. Do they have a top prospect, maybe their 3rd or 4th best prospect in their pipeline? Yeah, you can include that on top of the first and maybe a second, and maybe even another pick at some point. If it's 50% retained, Erik Karlsson is still one of the most attractive, if not the most attractive players on the trade market. Again, unlikely that the Penguins would be willing to do that, but if they were, boy, oh boy, that return would get very big, very quick. Let's go to Alex, who says, Karlsson, speaking of the devil, has a lot of trade rumors surrounding his future. Do you think with the proper defensive partner, he would be better to hold onto? In other words, shouldn't the Pens try and build a solid D-core around Karlsson and Letang? No, I just don't see it. I don't see a world in which Karlsson and Letang at 38, Karlsson, I believe 34, going to be 35 next season. I don't see that as a viable duo to build around for the future, mainly because who knows how long the future is for these two guys, right? Erik Karlsson has shown that when he wants to, he can still be the dynamic top of the line offensive defenseman that we've known he's been for his entire career. But at this point, the experiment has failed. The experiment has run dry, and there's nobody in the Penguins pipeline right now. I love Owen Pickering. I do. I really like what I've seen out of Emil Pieneniemi, but there's nobody in the Penguins prospect pipeline right now that is going to come up and immediately be that defensive defenseman that sets everything up perfectly for Erik Karlsson, that warrants keeping Erik Karlsson versus shipping him out and getting whatever you get for him, a first-round pick, a good prospect, whatever. I think that the experiment is run its course, and I think the Penguins need to move on. Now, they're going to move on with Karlsson and not Letang. That's guaranteed because of the previous ties before Karlsson got to Pittsburgh. But yeah, I think that he could still be that top-of-the-line offensive player. We saw it in that short-form tournament for the Four Nations, and I think if we see him go to a team, I understand that their general manager kind of refuted this at all. But if he goes to the Stars, he's going to excel. If he goes to the Kings, he probably excel. He's just not going to excel in Pittsburgh, and I don't see anything in the short-term future that could make me believe otherwise. Let's go to Flux CC. Shout out, Matt. Says, with Friedman mentioning Buffalo's AHL guys that are, quote, going to be players, who would you want Dubas to target? I like both Noah Ostlund and Isaac Rosen. Both are just about NHL ready right now. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Like, I'm not well-versed in the Sabres prospect pipeline, but those two are the two that I look at and say, yeah, that's probably what Dubas is circling in on, keying in on. Now, of course, like I mentioned, his scouting staff and he himself are much more well-versed in these guys than I am. But when I look at Buffalo, their entire prospect system is mostly at the NHL level, right? I mean, you have, I don't think Hellenius is at the NHL level, but Hellenius is another guy that I like. Buffalo's not going to part with him. So with that in mind, I'm right there with you, Matt. I'm looking at Ostlund. I'm looking at Rosen. I would prefer to have a guy like Peterka, but again, it's harder to wrestle those guys away, and the return would be a lot more expensive if they went for one of the NHL guys like Bowen Byram, guys like Dylan Cousins, who is at the top of everybody's trade board right now, whether it's, Frank Saravalli of Daily Faceoff, whether it's the Athletics trade board. Cousins is up there. Byram's up there. I think, Peterka is the name that I'm circling and hoping, we'll see what happens, but I'm hoping that that's the one that they eventually get, even though that's not as much a rumor as it was speculation from Elliot Friedman. Let's go to Christopher, who says, do we keep Glass and Tomasino? I think that's what the rest of this season is about. Tomasino the last couple of weeks has impressed me. And if I'm the Penguins, I'm locking up Phil Tomasino as soon as I can and saying, listen, you are going to be a middle six piece for us for the next 3 years at least, because he has impressed me a heck of a lot over the last 3 weeks. And even before that, he had his impressive games, but a lot of it was inconsistent, and especially the goal scoring was inconsistent. Now, the last 2 games, I said it earlier in the week about his game on Sunday against Toronto. I'll say the same thing about his game yesterday against Colorado. He didn't score, but he was one of the most impressive players on the ice for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's found something. I'm not sure if it's sustainable. I'm not sure if it's going to turn into massive results when it comes to goal scoring, but he's found something with Evgeni Malkin. And that, to me, matched with the fact that he's been making a lot of really solid plays in the defensive zone as well, I'm bringing back Phil Tomasino no matter what. Cody Glass is interesting. The Penguins have loved Cody Glass all season long, but they've also bounced him around the lineup. Now, part of that could be because they have faith in Cody Glass, whether that's at fourth line center, whether that's at second line wing, which he's been at both of them in the past 2 weeks. But I would imagine that they want to see more of Cody Glass, especially because, listen, it'd be great if next year we could see Puustinen, who hasn't been talked about, come up and make a difference. It'd be great if we could see Rutger McGroarty come up and make an instant difference. It could be great if we saw Koivunen, if we saw Ponomarev, but that's not guaranteed. What's guaranteed is Cody Glass is an NHL level player right now. He's proved it all year this year. He might not be able to put the puck in the back of the net with a lot of consistency, but you know what he does do? He plays a very, very solid game that has Mike Sullivan's trust. And how many times have we said, once you get Mike Sullivan's trust, it's hard for you to go anywhere? Drew O'Connor was one of the only young guys to do that 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And you look at what happened in his trajectory in the organization. I see Cody Glass kind of getting on the same train tracks that Drew O'Connor did, but when O'Connor was about 2 years younger than he is right now. Let's go back to Ryan, who says, do we expect Rutger McGroarty to make the move up to the NHL full-time next year? I think a lot of that's going to depend on the AHL playoffs this year. Kyle Dubas said it last year, and I think the same has to be thought this year, that he wants to see these guys go on a run at the AHL level. Right now, Rutger McGroarty is one of the best players on the AHL team. If he leads them to a Calder Cup run, if he leads them to a Calder Cup championship, they're going to probably put him in a spot where, leader in the clubhouse for one of the NHL roster spots. Whether or not he stays full-time, it depends on his development because it's not linear. If he continues to build, which is something that we saw in training camp last year, which is why he earned the opportunity right out the gate. If he continues to build, which is what we've seen throughout this season, kind of forming his full-formed game. If he continues to build and doesn't take steps back, he could 100% be a full-time NHLer by next season. But again, there is that if. He needs to be able to finish the season strong, have a really good Calder Cup playoff run, have himself a good offseason, and show up next fall ready to hit the ground running. And once again, prove to the Penguins that his development is going in one direction, and it's straight up. If he does that, I have a hard time believing that he's not going to be NHL caliber by next season. John-Claude Von Dunn says, can you please stop talking about Trevor Zegras? He can do a Michigan. I don't care that he can do a Michigan. I really can't. I really don't, because almost everybody in the NHL can right now. So that's not why I like him. Aside from that, and his age, he isn't really that special, and there are 10 to 15 other players that would be a better fit than him. I'm by no means saying he's the best fit for the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins have other players they can go out and get, but those players have to become available. And I don't know if there's that many players that are available and can fit under the Penguin salary cap and into their plans as well as Trevor Zegras. This year, again, I'd have to go back and watch him more this year, but this was going to be a big year for him. He suffered an injury that kind of slowed him down throughout it. That's my biggest concern with Zegras, is can he stay healthy and can he do what he set out to do coming into this year, which was be a better 200-foot player. He has the offensive capabilities. We know that he can put that together in an instant. Can he be that 200-foot player? That's what Anaheim wants to know. That's what they're testing him to be. Maybe if he comes to Pittsburgh, he's able to unlock that. That talent, that capability, that potential is still in there. And that's why I bring up Trevor Zegras, not because he can do a Michigan. Let's go to Bradley Vision, who says, are we expecting an active deadline or do we see all the moves during the summer? It seems more than likely that Rakell and Karlsson are going to be summer moves. There's a chance that could change, but I say more than likely feels like those are going to be summer moves. It's going to be a lot of depth pieces. I was shocked whenever Elliot Friedman mentioned Noel Acciari. If there's a chance that Noel Acciari is moved by this deadline, I will be surprised. If the Penguins can get anything of value for Noel Acciari, I would imagine, even though he's Kyle Dubas' dude, I would imagine he gets traded. It's going to be guys like that. It's going to be Acciari's. It's going to be Beauvilliers. Might even be a Matt Grzelcyk. Might even be a Blake Lizotte, who we talked about last week. There's a chance that the Penguins are very active. They certainly are going to be calling about a lot of players, and I'm sure teams are going to be calling about a handful of theirs. Whether or not they can get deals done, that remains to be seen. But right now, there are more people that believe they can go on a Stanley Cup run than there has been in multiple years. Because of that, a lot of teams are buyers. The good thing for the Penguins is a lot of the players that they have for sale are not players that are going to be ruled out of teams like Ottawa, who aren't going to go out and pay an arm and a leg for Erik Karlsson right now. They're not going to go out and pay an arm and a leg for Rickard Rakell right now because they would like to make the playoffs and they think they could make a run, but they're not quite in a position to sell the farm for this season. That's where additions like Beauvillier come in. That's where additions like Blake Lizotte come in, which opens the door up for the Penguins to everyone that fancies themselves even a little bit of a buyer at this deadline. So I think there's a chance that the Penguins are very active. Now you have to find deals, but there is a chance. Remember last year, there were rumors of the Penguins getting ready to sell everybody that was not named Crosby, Malkin, Letang, or Karlsson or Rust. And they only traded Jake Gensel, which was a big one, Magnus Hellberg, and Chad Ruhwedel. You have to find somebody on the other end of this, but I think the potential is there for the Penguins to be very busy over the next 48 hours. I'm hoping that I haven't missed a trade as I've been on this call. That was my biggest fear doing this episode and having a trade go down in the very middle. It's always fun, but you never want to miss it. But let's continue to go here to Blues Nation. Going to answer a few more before we jump off the episode here. Looks like we got a handful. Let's go to Blues Nation first. Do you think Murashov could have a cup of coffee as soon as next year? Again, goaltending development is very tough to figure out, especially when you look at the Penguin situation right now, where they got a lot of cooks in the kitchen. They've had a tough time balancing playing time this year, mainly because they've needed somebody to come up to the NHL level when it shouldn't have been a year they were up at the NHL level. The Penguins brought back Alex Nedeljkovic because they thought Joe Blomqvist needed the season, at least at the beginning of the year, down at the AHL. That's where they believed he needed to start. That's why they signed Alex Nedeljkovic last offseason. And yet, because of the struggles of Jari, Blomqvist had to come up probably a little more prematurely than they expected. And they also got Philip Larson, who turned out to be a revelation at the AHL level. So there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. I would be shocked if Sergei Murashov spent time at the ECHL next year as well. He needs to be in the AHL at the least. Whether or not he can break through to the NHL level, I think that I would say maybe, but the problem is you still have Tristan Jarry as of right now, who's going to be in his way. Whether or not he's in his way a lot, that remains to be seen, but he's going to be in his way no matter what. Alex Nedeljkovic is still under contract, and Joel Blomqvist still has a pretty good standing in the Penguins organization. I know a lot of people, because of his stint between January 16th and earlier this week, are down on Joel Blomqvist. He has a really good standing in this organization, deservedly so. Deservedly so. So I don't know if Murashov's going to get that chance. Philip Larson, maybe, because you also have to wonder, Murashov is the future. Murashov is the guy that I think has the highest ceiling, but he still has to pass some of these guys. Philip Larson is further along than Sergei Murashov. Even if it's by a little bit, he's further along. That means he's probably higher in the pecking order. So again, maybe he does. If he does, a lot of people will be excited about it. But as of right now, my personal opinion is that is an unlikely scenario unless we start to see some of these goaltenders get moved out. Let's go to Dante, who says, what are the realistic chances of Marner hitting the open market? You got to ask somebody from Toronto. From the outside looking in, it doesn't look like a fun situation. It just doesn't. I mean, Marner is going to be worth more than what Matthews is getting paid right now, simply because that's what the market will state. The Toronto Maple Leafs are a team of tradition, a team of our captain has to be paid the most, or our best player has to be paid the most. And yeah, it makes sense to some extent, but Austin Matthews didn't sign his contract with a $100 million salary cap. Mitch Marner is. So he's going to be worth a lot of money. Is Toronto going to create that artificial ceiling, which is what Austin Matthews makes? And if they do, how's Darren Ferris, who's Mitch Marner's agent, going to feel about that? How's Mitch Marner going to feel about that? Ferris is a client that is known for historically taking his clients to the open market. So is there a chance? Probably a chance. If I'd put a percentage on it, I wouldn't say it's too high because I think Toronto is smart enough to know what they have in Mitch Marner. So I don't know the full scope of that entire situation, but you'd have to ask somebody that's closer to the Toronto Maple Leafs in that aspect. But are there a realistic chance? Yeah. Is it 5% maybe? Yeah, maybe as well. Let's go down to Brian, who says, Sully's system works best when the Penguins are fast, evidenced by the 2 cups. I haven't watched the Baby Pens. Are the current key prospects fast enough to implement Sully's system? The best prospect, his biggest issue is skating. So the answer to that would be no. But McGroarty has taken strides forward this year with his skating. Koivunen has some speed from what I've seen. Other than that, the team as a whole is fast because it's young, but I don't know if it's NHL fast. Because to me, I think they have a little bit more room to be desired in that category. But again, you're right. Sully's system does work best when teams are fast. Look at Team USA. They had a lot of speed. So much speed that it made Jack Hughes look slow on that team. And Jack Hughes is one of the fastest skaters in the NHL, especially with the puck on his stick, because it's effortless. And he looked slow on Team USA because that's how fast Mike Sullivan had those boys playing. So we'll have to wait and see if these guys can get to NHL speed. Let's go to... Let me skip down. Only going to answer a couple more here. Let's go to 1966 first, and then we'll answer a couple more. 1966 Timber says, considering the current standings as last in the Metro, no hopes of a playoff run, and also our current goaltending core cannot stop a beach ball, why not give Murashov a shot? It's not time yet. It's not time yet. Unfortunately, we got to be patient with these guys. He's 20 years old. You have time. I understand there's excitement. I understand he is killing it for the Wheeling Nailers, and whenever he plays for Wilkes-Barre, he's killing it for Wilkes-Barre as well. But it is not time yet because, well, Alex Nedeljkovic, as I led off the show about an hour now, saying, has looked pretty good in his last 2 games. At least the last 5 periods, he has looked very good. A .944 save percentage to boot. Tristan Jarry, that book is very closed in my eyes, so I don't know. And Joel Blomqvist, again, I still believe that the Penguins believe that he has a lot more to give than what he showed in his latest thing. So it's just not going to happen. You don't see that jump from ECHL to NHL at the end of the season for a guy like Sergei Murashov, because he would also have to jump Philip Larson. I think if there was anybody that they were going to say, screw it, play the kid, it would be Philip Larson instead of Joel Blomqvist. That's just the way it's going to be, especially because it's Blomqvist's first year playing North American hockey. He's acclimated himself well, but I don't think they're ready to kind of expedite that and throw him into the fire, as it were, at the end of the season because of that. Let's go to Jean-Claude, who says, I can see us trying to sign Marner and Besser on July 1st. If that's the case, are we a playoff team with those 2 adds to this current roster? Maybe a playoff team. I think it's very, 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 it's not happening. They're not signing Mitch Marner and Brock Besser. They're not. If they're going to take a swing, they might take a swing on one player, but I don't think they're going to take a swing on 2 guys, especially 2 guys in their late 20s. Not both. Maybe if Marner goes to market, you check in on Marner, because everybody, 31 other franchises will check in on Mitch Marner's camp to see what he wants and to see if they have a shot. But I don't see them getting both of those guys. And even if they did, to answer the second part of your question, your defense is still bad. Your defense is still bad, and your bottom 6 is questionable because we don't know what Ville Koivunen is at the NHL level. We don't know what Vasily Ponomarev is as a third-line center at the NHL level, which is what he figures to be at his best. We don't know what Rutger McGroarty is in 2025-6 at the NHL level. I think you still have too many questions in the bottom 6. You still have way too many questions on the defensive side of the ice, and the goaltending, which is the biggest factor in all of this when it comes to how good a team can be. The goaltending is still a massive question mark. Alex Nedeljkovic is what he is, but what the heck is Tristan Jarry, and what do they do with him? What the heck is Joel Blomqvist with another summer under his belt? What is Philip Larson? Is that a guy that they view as an NHL caliber guy next year? He's certainly an AHL caliber guy. He's one of the best in the AHL, but do they view him as somebody that can make that next step? Those are all questions that need to be answered. So even if they go full fantasy hockey mode and bring in Marner and Besser, which I find unlikely, but even if they do that, I wouldn't put them in pen as a playoff team in next season. Let's go to Brian, who says, Belsky, the 4 pillars of hockey are technical, tactical, physical, and mental. Pretend you are Doc Frankenstein. Pick one player per pillar to create your monster. Okay, geez, this is a deep thought question here. I mean, the easy answer is Sidney Crosby for all 4. But I would go Sidney Crosby for mental. I don't think anybody thinks the game at the level of Sidney Crosby. Physical, I don't know if we're talking, like, if I can bring back prime Mario Lemieux physicality, because the dude could do anything on the ice, anything he wanted. But if we're talking present day, physical-wise, I'm going Connor McDavid. The skill set that he has, the shot that he has, the speed that he has, the skating ability and the puck handling that he has, the physical capabilities, Connor McDavid. Mental, Crosby. Tactical is a tough one. Honestly, tactical, give me Matthew Tkachuk. Because the way that guy thinks the game, the way that guy knows how to be the right version of what his team needs at all times is admirable. The way that he knows, today I need to be a talented player. I need to be the Matthew Tkachuk that puts in goals on goals on goals. Today, I need to be one half of the Bash Brothers like he was in that first game between US and Canada. Tactically, I think he is underrated for the way that he thinks the game as well. So I'd go tactical, Matthew Tkachuk, physical, gifted, Connor McDavid, mental, Sidney Crosby, and technical, Nathan MacKinnon. That's my Doc Frankenstein there, because you look at MacKinnon and just no wasted motion for him whenever he's skating down the ice. He has those piston legs running, but what he does technical-wise is unique. And if I could bring that into this amalgamation of talents, I would. So that's a really good question, Brian. You put me on the spot, but I hope I gave you an answer that you liked. Let's see. There was a trade. King Hoop says Tampa adds Yanni Gourde and Bjork. That's interesting. They get, here it is, Bjorkstrand. Frank Saravalli, 7 minutes ago. Lightning get Yanni Gourde back from the Seattle Kraken. They get Oliver Bjorkstrand and a 5th-round pick. In exchange, they give out another first-round pick. Oh, my goodness. That is 2 first-round picks in this one. Let me read the whole trade, and then I can respond to it. First rounder in 26, first rounder in 27, second rounder in 2025, Mikey Eyssimont, and that makes Tampa Bay's next first round pick in 2028. That is a insane trade. And listen, when I said I didn't want there to be a trade, I meant a Penguins trade, because I got to react in certain ways and do certain things before I can talk about it, even though it's fun. But this trade is a heck of a lot of fun. The Tampa Bay Lightning are a team that were battling for wild card spots earlier this year. They've been one of the hottest teams in the NHL in the last couple of months, and now they get back Yanni Gourde, who was a key piece to their Stanley Cups. They get Oliver Bjorkstrand, who is I believe, multi-time NHL All-Star and somebody who's going to be a great addition to their middle six. But they give up 2 first-round picks. That is insane. I think that makes the total mark right now 5 first-round picks that have been traded in and around this trade deadline season. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Let's go to, we have how many more here? We will go to, man, we got a lot of questions here. Let's go to Murad, who says, would you trade Ned in the summer and run a combination of Jari, Blomqvist, Larson? If I could do anything, I'd trade Jari away and run, Blomqvist, Ned, and then Larson as the number 3, but I don't see that happening. I wish it would, but I think I would rather trade Jari than Ned, although that is unrealistic. Ned, I'm not sure what the market's going to be for him, because like I mentioned, we can all see plain as day what Alex Nedeljkovic is, and if that's the case, that means other NHL GMs do as well. He's somebody that didn't come onto the scene in Pittsburgh and became what he was. Other teams have an idea of what he's like in the building, right? He signed a massive deal with Detroit and it went absolutely horrendously. So I don't think that door is open. And I think because of that entire experiment, there are going to be other teams that are going to have a much more critical eye on Alex Nedeljkovic, even if he's played better last year and this year for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I think a lot of people are going to look at him as a true backup. And when he's a true backup, there's a lot of options on the table for that. So I'm not sure Ned will get traded. Would I trade him? Again, maybe. But the problem is I just don't have faith that Tristan Jarry is going to be anything next year. So I'd rather trade Jarry. And I also don't want to keep Jarry and just let him be what he is this year, which is awful. That's just a fact. And then have to put a lot of weight on Blomqvist and Larson and maybe even Miroshov if things get really, really bad. Let's go to Bonehead, who said, trading Jaeger from McGroarty was a really bad mood. I'm starting to get the Hextall heebie-jeebies from Dubas. It's nowhere close. It's nowhere close. Kyle Dubas is miles ahead of what Ron Hextall was, and that trade is still working in favor of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Yeah, Braden Jaeger was a tough pill to swallow, and I love Braden Jaeger as well. But Rutger McGroarty is going to be a very good hockey player. Was he as polished and finished as we expected him to be whenever the trade went down? No, but they still got a very, very good hockey player in Rutger McGroarty, and one that is much better today than he was when that trade went down. So I know we wanted instant gratification. That was part of the emphasis of that trade is, hey, you're moving up the timeline. You're getting McGroarty before you would ever even get Braden Jaeger, but you're still getting a very good player in Rutger McGroarty, and a little bit of patience with him is going to go a long way because I think he's going to make a massive impact whenever he is indeed ready for the NHL. And I understand. The question then becomes, well, how much time did you buy yourself? If Braden Jaeger comes to the NHL next year, then that entire part of that trade, that entire facet of that trade is completely wiped out. And then it is simply who is the better player. But even with that, I'm not ruling out Rutger McGroarty from just being the better player in general. I think they're close to each other, but I do think that a little bit of patience is going to net very big results in your eyes with a guy like Rutger McGroarty. So he's been very good at the AHL level, and he just continues to keep getting better. Watch the AHL playoffs because I think he's going to put on a show. Bonehead has another one here. My question is, how do we get rid of Tristan Jarry? Luck? Literally luck, or another general manager saying, I'll bail you out. I will. I don't know if there is a way to get rid of Tristan Jarry. You could buy him out. You could. Unlikely, because you're going to pay, I believe, it's not a lot of money next year, but the following 2 years are $5 million dead cap, $4 million dead cap. And then I believe he's on the cap for 3 more years after that, which is a lot to eat, especially for a general manager that is so outspoken on hating that. So buyout is an option. It is an unlikely option. Trade is an option, but again, it is an unlikely option because he has not been good. At some point, it's just going to amass to, what does Kyle Dubas want to do? Because we saw this happen with, I think it was Jack Campbell in Edmonton. They ended up buying him out and terminating his contract, and he ended up being a free agent. It happened somewhere else. I just can't think of it off the top of my head. If Kyle Dubas stands firm on the fact that he doesn't like to buy players out, then might just be stuck with him for the time being until he plays better and you can offload him, or until a general manager says, you know what, I'm going to play God and I'm going to fix this broken asset. That's what it's going to end up being. Let's jump down to any more. We got any more questions? Actually, I think that's it. Although I am going to highlight this because it is hilarious. Bring back Casey DeSmith. I don't want that. Coin flip Casey was good when he was. He had some good moments, but I think the Penguins are set at the goaltending position, especially when they have 2 contracts, 1 contract that they can't move, and another goaltender that's signed for another year that is a bona fide backup being forced to be a starter. But that's going to do it for this trade deadline week episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We went a little over on this one, but that's because you guys had way too many good questions. I appreciate you guys as always. But remember, if you like this video, make sure that you like, share, subscribe to us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.